They are as real as our emotions, Shravani. And blues simply means it denotes a feeling, an emotion, and blues is associated with the feelings of sadness, with the feelings of melancholy, and with feelings of depressed mood. And people in a state of lockdown are almost certainly experiencing blues. I certainly did in the first few days, because this was certainly a big change for us, uh, and this was a loss event for us. For unfortunately, for many, the loss was by death, but for most people, the loss was loss of uh, their routine, loss of the things that they like, loss of ability to do things, and loss of movement, so, or loss of freedom. So invariably, we're going to feel these emotions. But these emotions, as you quite rightly said earlier, is that we are human and we must have these emotions. And as a psychiatrist, we often used to tell people that some amount of sadness and melancholy is almost essential. And for example, for music, for poetry, we need sadness, we need melancholy. That's when you get depth in your writing. And we don't necessarily have to treat and get out of blues. Uh, and so they are real. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to use them to our benefits. The problem, which we'll discuss later on, is that when the blues get excessive, and what do we do about it, and when does it start to become depression, which we'll talk about later on. Is that so that's the real worry, is that does the are the blues turning into depression for many people in a state of lockdown, which is now 39 days, if I'm counting right.
Yeah.
uh, and extended by another 13, 14 days. So it's
Yeah.
going to be a pretty long time. Uh, but I think we're all going to make out of this happier and wiser, uh, and more things to worry about. And then we'll work through them as well again, as we always do. And just to add one point, I think in my practice during the lockdown, while we are seeing a lot of people online, we are seeing one common reaction, which is stress. So stress is a reaction to external reality or perceived threats. And we are seeing two common emotions, which is fear, which you quite rightly put in the form of anxiety,
Yeah.
and we are seeing sadness, which is the blues that we are talking about today. So these are two common emotions everybody is experiencing, and
Right.
there's variable degree of these emotions which we need to address.
I think what's very comforting is the way you use the word everybody is experiencing. That makes us all feel part of a group because we are all facing these unprecedented things and a lot of uncertainty around us. It
Yeah.
can overwhelm each individual to think, look into their own self and see that this is not something I usually experience and feel about. So, lockdown blues are definitely for real. But I
Yeah.
think since we are all on lockdown, Dr. Roshan, one interesting thing probably we should talk about and discuss is as families, uh,
Mm.
we've, I think, probably never spent so much time together in the recent years. At least I haven't,
Yeah.
compared to the time we've spent during the lockdown with our families,
Yeah.
because of the schedules and busy working atmospheres that we've gotten used to.
Mm.
There are different age groups. There's so much talk about COVID, wherein how it does affect clinically geriatric population, pediatric population, and then people who have certain comorbid conditions. Could we also
Yeah.
categorize lockdown blues like that for the mental health as well, for different age groups and gender also?
So just to make it clear, that lockdown blues is not a clinical term, but it's an expression, it's a feeling, and so on. Clinical depression is a clinical term that we use in our practice. And what we know from depression itself, or for example, just coming back to the blues, it does affect gender differently. So, for example, women tend to internalize a lot of their emotions as compared to men. So, women take a lot of things in, they think a lot, they introspect a lot more than men. Therefore, they are more vulnerable to emotional problems, whereas men externalize their emotions. They don't keep it in, and they bring it out in the form of actions and anger and aggression, even sometimes. So they are less vulnerable to emotional problems. So a wide variety of emotional problems are more common in women and less common in men. So that doesn't make them any weaker, but it just shows that they are more emotive as a human being as compared to men.
Express.
So it does affect, yes. And in terms of age group, uh, we experience sadness in different age groups, because different age groups have different external perceptions, they have external expectations. For example, children need a lot more stimulation, they need a lot more interaction, they need a lot more activity compared to adults. So they are going to be experiencing a lot more anxiety, they're going to be experiencing a lot more confusion, and they're going to be experiencing a lot more upset about not being able to do things for which they can't completely comprehend or understand as to why not. What could possibly go wrong, and that is what we need to touch on later on, is to how to get them on board, to understand, to make them feel less gloomy. For working adults, for example, it's been a big change. Working from home is perhaps, for IT it has been quite common, but for many other people it's quite uncommon. So it's a complete change in workflow, in change in work schedule, and change in routine, a simple change in that ability to interact and mingle and share and learn at work. That is changed now. Now you're sitting alone at home, so you're not getting that kind of same support that you would otherwise get when you go to work. It changes your routine, it changes your structure of the day. So for working adults, it's going to be quite different, because they're going to be experiencing a lot more loss, not just at work, but socializing after work, getting that break after work, and unburdening their worries with their colleagues outside of work environment. So they are experiencing a lot more of loss. When it comes to older people, for them routine is very important, to be able to do certain things at a certain time. To they're not able to do that. For example, a lot of older people go for walks in the morning, they go and mingle and socialize in the daytime, they have rest in the afternoon, they go out in the evenings, they go to temple, for example, in a country like India. A lot of those things are not, you can't go to the temple as well. So a lot of things are just being robbed from us, and all age groups are affected quite differently. And in fact, I would say that we are not just experiencing sadness, we are experiencing a stage of grief. Grief is a reaction where we react to loss of life, or loss of loved one by death or separation, and loss of our livelihood and loss of our way of life. So we are experiencing grief, and many people are at quite at different stages of grief. Just briefly touch upon that. So for example, when the lockdown started, many of us were in the first stages of grief, where we experienced denial and disbelief that this cannot be happening. And then many went on to go to the stage of anger, where we started to look for who is to blame for this infection, who is to blame for this pandemic, and so on. Is it something that is done to us, or is it something that we did to each other? And then you denial and discomfort, and then you go into anger, then you went to bargaining, to say, bargaining is a stage where you simply say that if this passes, then I will quit smoking. So you bargain with a higher power, you bargain with yourself to say that if this passes, then I'll start exercising. If this passes, then I'll start becoming a better person. And the next stage, you go into a stage of depression, where you start to say that this is all over. The life is, there's no point to carrying on this life. And then the last stage is a stage of acceptance, where you start to accept the reality, and you start to say that this is not as grim or as bad, and we can work through this. And that's when you move on to a stage of working out how to work and come out of this stage. So many of us are going through stages of grief, and for different ages, it's going to be at different levels of grief and sadness, and it will going to affect them differently. Therefore, when we start to look at how to manage it, then we have to look at from different age groups and how do we help them.
Right. The reason, one more point I'd like to bring up here, the reason I wanted gender to be discussed is we are also hearing news from across the globe about how there is increase in domestic violence, and a lot of women complaining about domestic violence now that they're in lockdown. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Domestic violence was quite high in India, and I think there was a lot of reports to suggest that it was as high as 1 in 2. So that's very, very high. That's 50%. So out of every 2 women, 1 woman was subjected to domestic violence. And unfortunately, that percentage has gone up, and that for many reasons. One, people are locked in, people are restricted, people are spending a lot more time together. And so if it's a gender-based violence, it's often from men to women. But we also see a lot of violence from women to men as well. So that's a much smaller percentage. And because you're spending a lot of time together, the women are spending a lot more time with their abusers. In many cases, men, for example, would be uh, experiencing grief, and they would be expressing or externalizing their sadness or emotions in the form of anger and hostility and aggression, often towards a family member, commonly towards the spouse and partner. uh, One of the things that is very interesting and surprising is that not just that the emotions are getting expressed onto the family members, but many people who have been dependent on substances like nicotine and cigarettes and alcohol has also been a major cause for increase in domestic violence. One, either people are consuming their stock much more than they should, which is causing more intoxication at home and more conflict or flaring up a conflict. And two, people who have run out of stock are now experiencing withdrawal symptoms, and then they're bringing out those withdrawals in the form of anger and aggression. So both ways, the families are losing, the partners and couples are losing. So, and that needs to be recognized, to say that if each one of them is getting angry and frustrated, then what do we do about it? Domestic violence is a manifestation, just like fever is a manifestation of an infection.
A lot of times I think children being mentally affected gets ignored because they're supposed to be okay, or we
Yes.
rather look at adults first and then ignore children in this area. Would
Yes.
you want to talk a little about that? How should we be cautious about that?
Yes. I think compared to adults, children tend not to express their emotions and feelings. In other words, they will not say that uh, I am anxious, or I am depressed, or I don't want to live anymore. They would You would see emotive problems and emotions in the form of behavior. So an anxious child would be withdrawn and avoidant and doing less of what they like to do, or a depressed child would be quieter, would be more aloof, would be
Right.
less interacting, and so on. And and so that would, you can see in slightly older children. In much younger children, the behavioral manifestation will be even more. For example, they present the irritability of an adult or anger of an adult will manifest as a temper tantrum,
Yeah.
or defiance, or
Yeah.
becoming difficult, or
Yeah.
refusing things that they normally would do happily. So for example, not eating the food on time, or not following to some structures and routine, because their life is also disrupted, and we tend to think of only our life and our comfort and our disruption. We tend to ignore the children, hoping that even in times of difficulties they should behave as they always have done or always have been told. And one point to raise is that children learn a lot from observation, in terms of, or what we call as social learning. So if you tell them to do something, they do less of. If they observe you doing it, then they do more of that. So if you're calm in your interaction, if you do things in certain structured manner, then kids tend to follow that at all ages. So think about that. So,
Yeah.
and if the children are quiet and aloof or angry and irritable, then don't just look at the behavior. Ask them what is it that disturbing them, or sometimes confront them to say that, are they scared, are they anxious, is everything okay? Try to answer the questions. Don't try to make them sit down, as we always, many parents do. The child is restless and you just drag him, put him in a chair, and warn him.
Yeah.
That's not right. If they're anxious, ask them. If they have questions, answer it. That's the simplest way of helping them to be perhaps as calm as you are.
Yeah. Can you talk about the difference between people having an introvert and extrovert personalities, and how they might get affected with the blues differently, or how they might deal with it differently?
I think that's an excellent question, because when we look at the topic of resilience, and resilience is basically ability to face challenges and stress and to bounce back and recover. And when you're facing crisis, what you look at is to either you're resilient or you become resilient as a result of facing challenge and crisis. And when you look at the characteristics of personality in people who are resilient, then you look at personalities who are extroverted, people who are more optimistic, people who want to take risk, people who want to take initiative, people who want to experience and explore. So if you have extroverted, outgoing, positive, optimistic personality, then you are better able to handle crisis. Whereas if you're introverted, then you tend to emote, introspect a lot more, and sink into yourself a lot more. So introverted personality is not necessarily a bad thing, but in times of crisis, you want to be with somebody who's extroverted, somebody who has a positive charm and energy, and you imbibe some of that to develop that needed resilience. Whether
Right.
we like it or not, everybody, when we face crisis in a lifetime all the time, but when we do bigger or smaller crisis, we do come out more resilient and more resourceful.